Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Very happy to see everyone here. You know, the SPP, the School of Public Policy at the LSE, holds lots of events, and we have lots of special nights every year. But this is our biggest night. This is the annual lecture, a tradition that began when the school was launched 6 years ago. If my memory serves me right, the first speaker was the former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. I will not read the whole list, but remind you, some of you were probably here last year. Our most recent speaker was the editor-in-chief of The Economist, Annie Minton-Beddoes. And this year, we are particularly pleased and delighted and honored to be hosting Dame Sharon White. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As the cliche goes, Sharon needs no introduction, but I'm an academic, so I've got to provide one anyway. Sharon is a trained economist. She has degrees from Cambridge and from UCL. It's probably fair to say she's a Treasury person. And by that, I mean those of us who have worked in treasuries, we carry the Treasury within us, in our hearts. I see another Treasury guy right here in the front row. But of course, she's had a number of other roles in government in the UK, including at the Policy Unit number 10, the Department for International Development, the Department for Justice. She's had a very varied and rich and successful career. She's been a regulator. She was the chair at Ofcom, the Comms Commission in the UK. She's worked at the World Bank, and she's also worked in the nonprofit and private sector, most recently as first chief executive and then chair of the John Lewis Partnership, a very unusual and much beloved British institution. So given that we train students, some of whom go into government, some of whom become regulators, some of whom go into NGOs, other goes in the private sector, I cannot think of a more appropriate and exciting speaker than Sharon. Sharon, we're very, very happy to have you. Before we get going, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping here. Phones, turn them off, please. Put them on silent. The format of tonight is going to be, we're going to give Sharon the microphone to get the ball rolling with brief remarks, and then we're going to have a conversation. I will be privileged in asking the first few questions of that conversation, but then we will open it up to everybody in the audience and people online. This is a hybrid event, so the people who are here are not the only ones who are participating in this conversation. We also have plenty of current students, former students, and friends of the SPP online. And we will also have a few drinks afterwards so that some of you may have a chance to chat with our speaker after the events. For people using what used to be called Twitter, it is nowadays called X. The hashtag for tonight's event is hashtag LSE Public Policy. And so begin to think about your questions. You'll get a chance to speak up later on. But without further ado, let me simply say again, Sharon, welcome. Thank you for being here. Microphone is yours. I think you're going to speak
I might actually have
seat or stand up, either one, and then we'll have a dialogue. Thank you very much and welcome.
First of all, thank you so much for coming on a very cold Thursday evening, and it's fantastic to have so many people here, and thanks so much for everybody's online. Andrés didn't mention the reason I was at UCL for my master's was that I couldn't quite get on the LSE Master's Economics program, so I always have had this sort of burning desire to be sort of back in the building and back in what I had hoped would have been my sort of spiritual economic home. We're going to have a bit of a conversation this evening, and the topic and the sort of provocation, I think, is I guess it's a reflection of the sort of the kind of the macro and the micro context that some of us, had a career that's run for 35 years. There'll be others in the audience who are sort of relatively new into university and relatively new into the world of work. but certainly I don't remember a time, having been born in the 60s, having grown up really my student days in the 70s and 80s, that the issues facing politicians and the issues facing, I would also say linked to that, the business community or the leadership community has been so fraught and so challenging. And, you know, one can go through all the sort of macro indicators that we know, particularly with the ripple effects of the 2008 crisis, simply looking at the UK numbers, the fact that living standards are not going to be back to where they were in 2008 until 2025 with luck and a fair wind, the fact that productivity has flatlined, the fact that even in a country, whatever your politics with the United States, where the macro numbers look extraordinary, as we were talking about before, Andrés, and the US has voted in the way it has. And I think there is for me, a fundamental question as to whether government of whatever complexion is equal to the task of governing and providing well-being and good governance and prosperity and social cohesion in the 2020s. And I want to ally that conversation tonight a little bit with business, and that's partly because my my experience of the last 5 years has been in a very particular business, which some of you will know a little bit about, the John Lewis Partnership. Some of you may even have shopped with the John Lewis Partnership, John Lewis and Waitrose. Thank you so much. And what's extraordinary about that business is that it was set up explicitly as an alternative to communism in the post-war era. And the idea that before the welfare state, before Beveridge's slaying of the 5 giants, the idea was that a business that was owned by the people who work there, partners, that could provide universal healthcare, child benefits, stable, long-term work, could effectively do the job that governments weren't at that stage set up to do. And more than that, would be an incentive for the whole of the business community to follow the model and effectively sort of deroot communism at its sort of early stages after the war. So the debate about how good business and well-intentioned business steps in and works in an allied way with government for positive public policy and economic outcomes is the provocation for tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm sure this is an evening where we will all learn a few things. I have learned one already. I did not know that whenever I go buy cutlery at John Lewis, I'm contributing to the fight against communism. This is a wonderful idea. So plenty to talk about. Clearly, it's not only a cold night out there, it's also a scary world out there. Sharon and I were discussing some of the challenges as we were having a cup of coffee a minute ago. But let's begin with Treasury issues. Get them out of the way. You were saying that you're hoping that government can do its job. But of course, doing government's job requires money. And money seems to be in short supply in many countries, including pretty well-off countries like this one or the US. I was looking at the numbers to make sure I would get them right before coming here. Public debt in the UK at the end of September reached 98.5% of GDP. So give or take a little bit, it's about equal to GDP by the end of the year. That's higher than any time since 1945. In the US, the equivalent number is 120%. It used to be the case that there were countries, in South America and places like that where fiscal crises happen all the time, but large, rich, English-speaking countries didn't have to worry about these things. However, we had a little episode called the mini budget in the UK not too long ago, which revealed that, pension funds and hedge funds can dump British debt in the same way they can dump Brazilian debt or Mexican debt or South African debt or Turkish debt. how worried should we be in two senses? First of all, are we getting into trouble if we keep spending? And secondly, given all these unmet social needs, do we need to raise tax, cut other things? If the Prime Minister of the UK stepped in here and said, Sharon, help me solve my budget challenges. Give us some advice.
I mean, I guess the step back point, and it is, I mean, I used to be responsible for the public finances. So you look at these numbers and you do sort of wake up in a cold sweat at 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's important to remember, obviously, that we had 2 once-in-a-generation shocks in the space of just over a decade. So the 2008 financial crisis, it wasn't simply the big bailouts to the banks, but the UK economy is around 4-5% smaller on a permanent basis. And there's a, you know, some of you have read Martin Wolf, there's a big debate as to whether effectively pre-2008, the UK's economic performance was flattered and quite what's driven this sort of permanent sort of loss in productive potential. Did you have a long tail of effectively unproductive businesses that were effectively sort of kept alive because interest rates were so low? And then, of course, the pandemic, both the impact of the pandemic directly, but then obviously the sort of big fiscal transfers, you know, that all of us benefited from, both to keep people in work, but also to then deal with the sort of subsequent cost of living crisis. So big context. And I think it's important then to react in a way that recognizes that effectively we had sort of 2 kind of big kind of semi-exogenous shocks. And then the question is, that's great, we're spending all of this money, but I can't get a GP appointment. And you know, my local primary school that I was going to send little Johnny to is about to close down because actually the teachers can't afford housing in a commutable distance. And I think this is why I think the public-private conversation is so important, because there is limited fiscal capacity. I mean, I think my former colleagues at the Treasury did a pretty good job with the budget, but it was, you know, they had a hairy couple of days with the market. And so those big transfers on infrastructure, but also public services, have got to involve a very significant private component.
So does that mean that we should be thinking about more private provision of public goods? Is that technically feasible? Is it politically desirable? Will it get us in political trouble? I mean, many countries have experimented with this. Of course, the UK did a little bit in the Blair years. What is your take on that experience?
I mean, I think it's inevitable that there will be more private provision. And obviously, private provision has many different forms. It could be, you know, private funding of hospital infrastructure. It could be, you know, more personnel that are drawn from the private sector. I think it's inevitable, and I think the only way through these big political dilemmas, particularly I think as they pertain to the NHS in the UK, is by having the adult conversation between those who are governing and those who are governed.
I come from a country where many such services are provided by the private sector. It works often. Often people hate it. So it's, you know, it's not an easy conversation to have, but I think you're absolutely right. It's an inevitable conversation. When you and I were having coffee upstairs, we were asking the following question, and you said some fascinating things that I was hoping you might share with our audience here. Governments have to government and deliver. At the same time, if one looks at political outcomes recently in the world, and of course we all have the big US election in mind, it is striking how even in circumstances in which the economy seems to be doing reasonably well, you know, yes, the US had inflation 2 years ago, but the inflation rate is 2%. The US is under full employment. The economy is growing much more than any other G7 economy. Nonetheless, to say it in plain American, voters remain really pissed off. So you are a trade economist, I'm a trade economist. We're used to thinking You deliver on the goodies, the voters are happy. It seems nowadays you deliver on the goodies and the voters are still not happy. What's changing, and what should we do differently?
I mean, the debate that we had is that, and in fact, the big debate we had as to whether the numbers are changing sufficiently in a way that I feel as an ordinary citizen.
Right.
And I think, if you're an incumbent government pointing to your record of success, you're going to point to growth. You're going to point to macro numbers on unemployment. You're going to talk to the fact that prices,
Right.
yes, they're still rising, but don't worry, they're rising by 2%. They're no
Right.
longer rising by 10%.
Right.
But my grocery bill is 30% higher than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And not only is it 30% higher, you as a politician are telling me that I should be grateful because actually the rate at which I'm feeling the pinch in my pocket is somehow diminishing. So I think I think one of the things that's happening is that there is such a language gap and such almost an empathy gap and an understanding gap. You talked about respect. But I think the more that politicians talk about these sort of macro trends, the less I feel that you're speaking for me and my life. And you're not having to worry about whether the heating's going on today when my prepayment meters run out for the month. So I do think there is a whether you love Trump or dislike Trump, you kind of know what he's going to do. Okay?
And you know that whatever he's going to do, he's going to say it in very plain language.
It is, he's worried that my community looks different. Don't worry, there's going to be a deportation program.
Right.
He's worried about, manufacturing goods going. Don't worry, there's another wall that's going to be built, and it's called a wall of tariffs. And so whether it's the right policy or the wrong policy, it's a set of measures in language and in conversation that speaks to me in a way in which telling me that unemployment across 300 million people is at a level that I should be grateful for adds to and attenuates the disconnect with the political class.
So maybe part of the problem, let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. I hope I am. What we have is problems with outcomes. Numbers may look good. People's lives are not necessarily that good. But in addition to that, there's a credibility and legitimacy crisis because voters look at people like us in this room and they say, why should we believe you? I was a finance minister. I once ran for office and people used to say, what's exactly what you just said? I mean, a voter once said this to me in a marketplace. He said, you're a macro guy. I'm a micro person. What do you know about my life? Fair point. I probably didn't know that much about that person's life. At the same time, everybody in this room here is training to be a leader. And I have no doubt they want, the best for their countries and communities. So they ought to be credible and legitimate, but they will face exactly the same problems everybody else is. So 2 questions, and neither one can be tackled easily. One is, any thoughts on how we bridge that gap and how we become somewhat more credible or less incredible? And connected to that, we all think democracy is a great thing, but democracy seems to be in trouble. Increasingly, in a country like the US, I'm going to quote some numbers here carefully because Ali's in the front row and she knows them much better than I. But, if you ask Americans, is democracy the best system of government? Increasingly, people are saying no. And particularly if you ask young Americans, those numbers are larger. And the US is not alone in this respect. So this is not just an economic crisis, it is a political and democratic recession, depression. I know that I cannot ask you, what do we do about it, because it's way too broad, but what are your first couple of thoughts on that?
We'll get to some good news at some point as well. Everybody's going to be so depressed at the end of the conversation. I mean, I think, I'm a big data person. And I think there is something about the numbers that we collect and the data that we collect and how that speaks to different communities and different regions and different lives. And understanding that what's true of London is not true of the rest of the country, understanding what's true of farming is not what's true of Silicon Roundabout. I think there is something about how the political class, and in that I also include civil servants and those of us who are training to be sort of public service leaders, is it's really incumbent on us to understand the tail and who's at the end of the tail beyond those big picture macro points. And to be in the community, some of us will have been, I come from a, kind of very working class immigrant community myself in East London, but that's a long time ago. And that's not the life I live today. And so there is also something about how as a policy and political class, we're actually embedded and understanding how the lives which are showing up in the polls.
Is that inevitable? Are we training future leaders incorrectly somehow?
I think if we're training our future leaders only within the confines of the Marshall building, we're in deep difficulty.
Get out, guys. You've heard it.
And it's true. I mean, when I was at the Treasury, I mean, you were almost frowned. You almost had to go on a clandestine mission to talk to stakeholders and those outside the building because it's such a confidential process around the budget. But I think if we cannot describe the lives of our citizens and voters, we don't deserve to be leading public agencies.
Well, today, John Prescott died, who was probably, Rich in the room will correct me here, the last very, very senior politician to have an obviously working class background.
Not the last.
I mean, the people who've been that high up in government, right? Who've been, at deputy prime minister, right?
I mean, if you look at the current cabinet,
It's more diverse than previous cabinets.
It's much more diverse.
But it would be fair to say that the share of people with elite educations from Oxford, whatever, in British politics went up substantially, say, between 1945 and 2010, right? Or 2020. Maybe that's beginning to reverse itself now. Might that be part of the problem, that the composition of, say, Parliament is turned in the wrong direction?
I think it's a misplaced point. So actually, just in terms of the facts of the current cabinet is more working class, I think, than any cabinet since the post-war period. Angela Rayner, probably an even tougher.
Fair enough. Angela Rayner is the obvious other, absolutely.
Who's deputy prime minister, even more so than John Prescott.
Yes.
I mean, I think the phrase, it's not where you come from, it's how do you build a natural empathy gene? And so, you could have gone to Eton and Oxbridge, but have a deep understanding and feel of what it means to be a citizen who's struggling on the breadline. And you could come from an incredibly working class background and also not have that connection. So I think it is around how we're educating. I don't know how much even on our courses we are spending time. I mean, something I used to do in all the jobs I've done, not always very successfully, but being out in the field and in the services to see how big or how small the gap is between the kind of Westminster rhetoric and the practical impact of policy.
So on that point, on the point of translation and cultures and subcultures and silos, a little bit about the public versus the private sector divide. You worked in the executive branch, then you were a regulator, then you moved to the private sector, not just any private sector, a very special kind of private sector. So just as there is kind of a culture gap between governing elites and voters, there's probably a culture gap and a language gap across these different sector subcultures. How big was that gap when you left, say, Ofcom, you went to John Lewis? Did you say, oh, this is very different, not so different? Was there some effort at translation you had to engage in there as well?
I mean, it's a really interesting question because, I think in government, I think depending on the party, there can be a real sort of suspicion of business. And And actually my experience of the last 5 years, and although, as I say, the partnership is a bit like if the public sector ran a business, it would be a bit like the John Lewis partnership. But actually the degree of good that's done by most UK businesses, whether that's in terms of good jobs or career progression or kind of broadly speaking social welfare, I think is tremendous. And I think there is a lot of myth busting between the public and private sector to be done. Or public sector good, private sector bad. Listed companies good, private equity bad. Tech bad, needs regulation and harms reduced. Manufacturing good because we can see and touch and feel and understand. And I think if there have been any kind of early sort of some things lost in translation, I think for the last few months of this government having had a very successful and effective engagement before the election, it is, I think, seeing some of those myths that actually people do genuinely want to engage. I think government's more complex. I'm sorry if there are any of you about to hit the private sector or have been in business. You know, the partnership is a very particularly complex business because we're also operate as a democracy. But in most businesses, that sort of single line of accountability where an alignment between your shareholders and your investors and your board and your executive team, you don't have that luxury in government, where even getting alignment across your cabinet table is not necessarily always straightforward.
You mentioned that the partnership was a democracy. Of course, most businesses are not. I've been reading an American philosopher called Elizabeth Anderson, who recently wrote a book saying, yes, we have democracy when we vote for members of parliament or presidents, but in our day-to-day lives, we spend 8 hours in some room taking orders from somebody whom we did not elect. So we have democracy at one level of our lives, but we don't have workplace democracy. Your company, until recently, has a bit of that. Is the hope, the dream of workplace democracy just that, a dream? Is it workable? What are the lessons from a place like John Lewis that could be applied elsewhere?
I mean, it's workable and it's a tough gig. I mean, the partnership, 70,000 people, 21 million customers. The one is its scale. 1 in 3 people in the UK shop with the business and 12 billion revenue. So this is not it's probably now the second or third largest sort of experiment in industrial democracy in the world. The business is governed by 3 institutions. So the chairman is a sort of institution in their own right. There's a board, and a third of the board representatives are elected partners within the business. And then there's a council, which is composed of 60, mostly shop floor partners and shop floor workers, all of whom are elected every 3 years. And there's a constituency map, which looks a little bit like the constituents in the House of Commons. And they are responsible for all the kind of, I would say, really pivotal shifting, rebalancing decisions in the business. So changing the mission of the business, deciding to take on external funding, all require 2/3 majority vote by council, which makes the organization, when everybody's lined up, I would extraordinarily powerful and effective. It also makes for a very, very consensual culture, and the kind of demands for leaders to be able to engage while acting decisively in an organization that is highly consultative is quite a skill.
Help us thinking about what the lessons from that experience might be for run-of-the-mill private sector companies. You know, certain Western European countries, law mandates that boards have representatives of workers. there's a lot of talk of stakeholder democracy in which users or buyers or clients may also have a say in the running of the company. On the other hand, conventional economists say, oh, no, that's not quite right. That only makes the running of the company more complicated and more cumbersome. So what in that experience is translatable in your view to your average private sector company?
I mean, they may not love it because it makes life more complicated, but I think I guess the sort of aspect of the partnership that I found most valuable and is probably most translatable is having elected representatives on the board. And they're not worker representatives in the way in which you might find in a sort of German model. They have full fiduciary responsibilities as
like every other board member.
Like every other board member. And I've had members, one of whom ran a shop, one of whom was a relatively junior person in our property team. So they're right across the business. And they give an insight, and often they're much, much tougher than a sort of a kind of more classic, conventional non-executive director. There's definitely a really helpful connection and bridge to how not ordinary partners, but the broader group of partners are feeling in the business. And I think that has worked, I think, incredibly well. It's still pretty rare in corporate Britain. So I think Capita, which is a big outsourcing FTSE 100 company, is probably the only business that's taken this on to some degree.
Although in Germany, as you pointed out, Scandinavia, other places, quite common.
Yeah, it's definitely more common in Scandinavia.
So let me ask you a related question. It's going to be a nerdy academic question, but it was actually prompted by something you said, not now, but we had a Zoom chat when I had the opportunity to invite Sharon to do this. And we talked a little bit about private sector, public sector, partnerships, et cetera. And you, in passing, said, I've been thinking about the following question. And I thought that was such a fascinating point that I want to bring it up now. You said, I've been wondering why it is that in capitalism, it is capital that hires labor and not labor that hires capital, which is, as deep a question as the social sciences can ever come up with. I have $1 million. I open up a company. I hire a bunch of people. Why could it not be that I have a bunch of people who have talents and human capital, and I hire capital? You compete to serve me because I've got the human capital. Tell us a little bit about your musings on this big question and how it bears on these other things we've been talking about.
Not sure I have many answers, although at some stage I'm sure we're going to have to bring technology and AI into this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was partly prompted because the whole sort of philosophy of the partnership as a business is labor employing capital. And that has some amazing advantages, higher levels of engagement, lower turnover, longer tenure, etc. But at the margins, the risk is that you have an overinvestment in labor, in the pay bill, in bonuses, and an underinvestment in technology right at the moment where, particularly in the sector I was in, your profit margins are becoming increasingly tight. And you've got the big question about how is AI now used? Is it used in the mantra to create better, more fulfilling jobs? Or is it now used in a very sort of transactional, instrumental way, which is essentially to tackle the cost base, and you have a flip where capital technology effectively gets preferenced?
Well, one of the three guys who won the Nobel Prize in Economics last week has been writing increasingly about how it is that we can direct technical change. A lot of these innovations are such that, in fact, they substitute for labor instead of being a complement to labor. And, Darren would argue that, in fact, we can create incentives for innovators to do otherwise, including very prominently what you just mentioned, which is AI. Is this something we should be thinking about? Is that optimistic? Is that feasible? Or is that a bit of a pipe dream?
I think in a sense, this goes back to almost the opening of the conversation. I mean, you know, I am sort of genetically predisposed to be an optimist. I think the genuine answer to the dilemma between the kind of fiscal crunch, productivity crunch, and the desire and exigency for better public services, I think all roads lead to technology, and many of those roads lead through AI. I think the real incumbency for those of us who are going to be public service leaders in the next generation is kind of, how do you do it? There's, you know, it's very easy to say AI is the answer to the NHS's productivity crunch. Well, what does that mean? How do we even kind of pull together the data to feed the models in a way that is socially acceptable and acceptable to patients? But I think that is, you know, if I were designing the curriculum for the next year, how AI is a generator for public service reform and efficiency and quality, I think is absolutely kind of key.
We had a 3-hour meeting this morning thinking about the curriculum. So, and we talked a lot about AI. We were not quite sure where to put it, but that's
In the middle.
in the middle. And of course, technology probably also has to be our savior when it comes to the green transition, right? With current technologies, it's not clear we can pay for the whole thing. With more efficient technology, the whole thing seems a bit, or a great deal more manageable. Let me ask you a couple more questions, and then enough from me, and we will open it up to the audience. And the next question is a bit more personal, but also policy oriented. Your parents came from Jamaica. You said recently in a great interview, if you haven't read it, guys, have a look at it, in Lunch with the FT, interview with Martin Wolf. Sharon said, "I am a poster child for migration." And I can imagine what you had in mind when you said that. We're in a room full of people who are migrants. I'm a migrant myself. My parents were migrants. Nonetheless, the world doesn't seem to be too keen on migration. From a policy point of view, this is the paradox, of course, because aging societies are going to need more migrants, whether people like it or not. On the other hand, 2 or 3 months ago, I forget exactly when, we had anti-migrant riots in the United Kingdom. The gentleman who's going to be the president of the United States told the world that migrants eat cats and dogs. So we seem to be between a rock and a very hard place here. As the poster child for migrants, and as somebody who I'm sure has thought long and hard about the role of migration in development, how do we square these circles? Any thoughts on that very, very hard question?
I mean, I think I said the reason I was the poster child is my parents are both part of the Windrush generation, and my mum kind of barely went to school. Did maybe 2 or 3 years of elementary school. My dad had, I think, left when he was about 13 or 14. And I mean, if my parents hadn't migrated to the UK, the story for their family, for my brother and me, would have been kind of just radically different. I think what's interesting when you look at how citizens react to migration is that the communities who are most anxious or most concerned are those that have the smallest proportion of migrants. And the communities that feel most comfortable are those who live, work with, kids go to school with. And maybe that's the place to start. So maybe the place to start is less politicians talking to citizens, and it's finding ways for communities to be able to talk to other communities. And as you know, when you do these sort of big surveys, do you love migrants? Well, I'm quite fearful, but actually when you know, who was the person who was your midwife when you gave birth? My goodness, she was amazing. And who's the person who's looking after your father in the care home? So when these things are personalized and close, the story and the perception will be very different. And I think, again, big question, I think, for politicians, but for those of us in the room, is how to have the brave conversation with the public, that you can have secure borders, but actually, when you look, as you say, at the demography, and the UK is not far behind some of the very difficult trends in continental Europe, the UK and Europe will be countries of increasing migration over the next 10 to 15 years. And the only way to avoid some of the difficulties on the breakdown in social cohesion that we saw this summer is by stepping into that much more variegated and much more personal conversation.
You're absolutely right, not just within Britain or within any given countries, of course, across nations. Within the European Union, the countries that are most anti-migration are countries like Poland and Hungary in Eastern Europe, which receive the least numbers of migrants within the EU. So I'm very, very sympathetic to what you're saying, and I suspect everybody in the room is too, because, you know, in the School of Public Policy, something like 97% of our students were not born in the United Kingdom. So you can see how there will be natural sympathy in the room. But let me just maybe stay with the subject for a minute. What you're suggesting must be right, but it's very hard, right? Because even in countries where 10, 15 years ago, the median voter was fairly tolerant, open-minded, had the experience of that, you know, nurse who saved his life, who happened to be a migrant, we have seen, even in those countries, a backlash. You know, in rich, progressive countries in Scandinavia, in Germany, under Merkel. I come from a country which historically didn't take migrants. We took 2 million migrants, 10% of the population over the last decade. I was one of the ministers signing the legislation, making migration to Chile even easier. And today, you know, we're in the midst of a massive anti-migrant backlash. We may have a far-right person running the country in the next year. So you're absolutely right. We need to have this conversation, but the skeptic in me wants to say we've begun that conversation. It doesn't seem to be going very well, is it?
And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying I think that the alternative, which is that migration numbers rise and politicians say that migration is bad, and you end up with an even bigger political credibility deficit. Now, you know, whether part of the answer is being, you know, much clearer about the skills needs in the country, whether part of it is being much clearer about the support and the training and the education and the transition, particularly with AI, for those who were born in the UK, so it doesn't feel as though there's somehow a difference, you know, different in level, there's not a level playing field. But I don't, you know, unless we are literally going to go into kind of negative productivity territory, it can only be confronted and debated in a way that's adult.
And the numbers very much speak to that. Tony Travers, who's not here, but who'll be here soon, pops into my office occasionally and shows me numbers about migration in the UK. If one of the reasons for Brexit was a slowdown in the number of migrants entering the UK, those numbers have gone up, not down every year. And for a very good reason, because the dynamics of the labor market are such that without those migrants, this economy would be growing even less than it is, right?
It was also a deliberate policy of the government, paradoxically.
Yeah. So let me ask one last question from me, because I'm sure there are plenty of people here who want to come in and raise points or ask questions. And my last question is going to be very practical. You know, you've worked as a policymaker, as a regulator in the private sector, in Washington, in an international financial institution. Pretty much everybody in this room, except for the front row, we're all professors who have jobs already. Everybody else in this room will be looking for a job in a year or 2 or 3. And many of our students
come and queue up at the end.
But you know, many of our students faced exactly that dilemma. I want to have, you know, some impact on public affairs, public discussions, public policies. Should I do it from the Treasury? Should I do it from an NGO? Should I do it from the World Bank? Should I do it being an activist out there in the field? You know, you've done a bit of all of these things. Some people say, well, I want to focus on one thing. I'm going to join a central bank and spend 30 years there. Other people say, oh, no, I want to do a bit of each and learn. You've done the latter. You've done a bit of each and learn, no doubt. So my last question is, give us a little career advice. Not to me, but you know, people come into my office and say, should I work for the World Bank or should I be an activist? And I say, I have no idea. Ask Sharon White.
I still think I don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up. So maybe I'll be taking career advice from everybody in the audience. I think it's a long life. And I think that the great advantage coming into the labour market today and coming into the jobs market today is the decision that you take when you're 23 or 24, 32 or 33 is not a decision for life. And I think trying, you know, I've worked in, as you say, I mean, I'm slightly embarrassed by how many institutions I've worked in, but the thing that is a big motivator for me is having, even if it's in a tiny way, is having the maximum impact in terms of the number of people. So there will be others in the room for whom actually having a really sort of deep impact on a family or a community that's super visible and tangible. I'm a kind of policy geek, sort of, you know, top to bottom. And so for me, what impact can you have on a scale that's national or international, not in an arrogant way, but its scale for me is super important. And then diversity is really important. So working with different nationalities and different personality types and that learning that you get from people who come from just very different backgrounds and cultures. But I would just say try some things and, you know, have some fun. I think, you know, you're going to be working till you're 85. There are no pensions. Have fun. And I generally think kind of ignore your parents' advice, particularly those who've paid for your studies, who kind of always want you to get into the kind of, you know, high remunerated job. I think that the ability to do good with the work and the education you have in the time that we're living in is so tremendous and is such a privilege. You know, it's just very exciting to kind of reconvene in 10 years' time and to see the impact everybody's had.
So you heard it here first. You can be a policy geek and have fun. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Sharon. I could go on. Many other questions come to mind, but it would be unfair if I monopolized the microphone even more. So there are roving microphones out there, and you'll get a chance to ask your question. Why don't we start right here? And then Professor Garicano will be next.
Thank you very much for a beautiful and very inspiring discussion towards the end. My question is more on the boring technical side of things, relates to the topic on how government and private sector should work together. There are different, like, my question would be, where do you see the most potential? One thing you touched upon was health, for example. I do agree. I think it's inevitable and it's important that we integrate private sector, but I fear that it might come at like a more of a backlash of more increasing inequality. Do you think this is a risk, and if not, why do you think there is no risk?
So can you just say your name?
Camelia.
Camelia. Nice to see you. I mean, I think probably the most straightforward and the most direct way of having a true, particularly on the funding side, true public-private partnership is probably infrastructure. I mean, I'm going to talk from a very narrow UK perspective, whether that's, I mean, water is probably too difficult to talk about at the moment, but whether that's transport or housing or power or the green transition, I think 95% of the funding and the support and certainly the skills and the management and the leadership will be from the private sector. And if you talk to most investors, I'm about to work for a Canadian pension fund that's the biggest infrastructure investor in the world. Most stand ready, provided that there is a stable sort of political, economic policy environment, and there's the potential for that over the next, let's say, the next 10 years. I mean, I think you're absolutely right on health, and I think health education, they are such emotive, there's such emotive services, the NHS, may possibly be less of a religion in the UK than it was 10 years ago, but it's still something that is so close and familial. But at the same time, I think there is probably now the scope for more of a debate about how the private sector in an appropriate way. I think where people will be concerned about is inequity based on income and wealth. So, you know, the idea of obviously introducing primary care charges or you know, significant differences in quality of access between state and private hospitals. But there's already significant private sector involvement in a way that isn't really articulated and isn't really talked about by hospital leaders, by politicians. So I think, I mean, as I say, I may be naive. My optimism may come from naivety, but my optimism comes from the alternative, which is in, you know, steadily diminishing services with a big increase in the democratic deficit. So I think infrastructure is the most straightforward, not easy, but the most straightforward. But I think healthcare definitely has potential. I think technology, it's hard to see that technology and AI isn't going to be provided supported expertise through and is already through the big tech company.
Thank you. Luis.
Welcome to LSE. We're thrilled to have you, and we clearly made a major mistake some decades ago when we didn't take you. We hope you'll hang out a lot in the future. So you've been working at delivering services to citizens, and one of the things that is giving rise to populism, I think, is the fact that governments don't seem to deliver and don't seem to work. And this is particularly, it seems to be particularly the case in the United Kingdom. So 360,000 planning pages to get this lower Thames crossing, 4 times the cost for the nuclear plants, the Hinkley 3, than in any other place. The HS2, compared to my country, the HS2 is taking quite a bit more cost than the 4,000 kilometers we built of train. So why is the UK government, I guess all governments, but you have seen this one, why is it so hard to get things done?
Yeah.
And what do we need to do to make things, to actually get things done?
Yeah, I think it's $1 million question. And I think that's where, I mean, obviously a big factor in recent times has been just the historic degree of instability that the UK has had. And I think that's obviously not just affected the fact that we've had, whatever it's been, five prime ministers in a small number of years. But it also affects, I know there are civil servants here as well, I think it also affects the civil service, because actually the periods when you're working for single government or a single Secretary of State that is initiates a policy and is also there for delivery, that's happened in so few departments. So I mean, it's a caricature, but it has a semblance of truth that for some civil servants, actually the biggest skill over the last period of time has been almost inducting new ministers into the department before they've then sprung out. And it's a semi-serious point. And so even having the political will in Westminster, when you're talking particularly about planning, where I think there's masses of opportunity for streamlining, you've then got to have that across the cabinet, across regions, across constituents, because these are always seriously local issues. Now, there were some policy levers there. So I think one of the good things that the government has done is that where you do have a successful planning permission, the uplift in land values, part of that then gets shared within the local community. So there are also now, I think, very sensible financial incentives. But that instability means that, so you're thinking about building a bypass through my community, you know what, I'm just going to wait until the next. Right. So I think, as I say, I think positively, you know, I'm not a party pre-person, but the fact that you've got a government with a large majority and with the opportunity for follow through and not just the speech that you suddenly think, well, I've made the speech and why has nothing happened? But then getting the machinery and then the incentives with the flow through to locally, I think has got, particularly on planning, I'm reasonably optimistic. Oh, massively important.
Quick follow-up before we go back to the audience. You mentioned rotation in the civil service. Some countries have a civil service which is deeply specialized.
So
You join agriculture, you stay there forever. In this country, they rotate. Is that a good idea?
So there are two things in terms of rotation.
Uh-huh.
Rotation of ministers, and I don't know the latest numbers, but I suspect the average tenure of politicians has been about somewhere between 9 and 14 months.
Right.
I think over the last sort of 8 years. And then it's interesting. So the positive of the civil service in the UK is that it is a permanent civil service.
Right.
And so they're right the way through to being the top official in the department is a civil service, impartial, non-political appointment. And even with lots of debate and controversy, there are still relatively few political advisors, special advisors. Each Secretary of State and main minister may have 2 or 3 or 4. So it's still a very, very small part of the political governance in this country. And then the question about tenure, I think, varies hugely. I mean, when I was, now I'm quite out of date, when I was at the Treasury, had tended to be a department which had very fast turnover within particular roles, because people, you do a budget, you move on, you do financial services, you move on. I think some of that has started to change. So, you've got, I think about the lead official at the Department of Work and Pensions has been in that role for 7 years. The lead person at the Department of Health has been in that role for more than 5 years. So I would slightly argue with very rapid rotations. I think you do get that through sort of more junior levels as people are learning and training, and some of that's a positive. But the broader issue, I think, has been the very rapid turnover of the politicians.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm a student here at the School of Public Policy. My name is Aya, and I wrote down my question just so I wouldn't forget it. It's also kind of a very theoretical question, but I think important. How much can we trust the underlying economic assumption that the destruction of jobs comes with the creation of new jobs, especially in developed countries that become more service-based? And I think this relates to this topic because obviously public sector is worried about unemployment, and private sector, well, it's a supply side issue. How much labor do we want to hire? So.
Gosh, that's a really hard question. So I mean, it's a theoretical question, which maybe I'm going to try to answer in a practical way. I would say in business, there is probably no harder thing than making somebody redundant. And when I say hard, I mean not necessarily even as a practical issue, because actually our labour laws are pretty flexible. But you will not talk to a business leader who won't say to you that the fact that they've had to make redundancies is somehow a sign of failure. And so I think it goes back a little bit to the cultural point that even with technology, which is obviously potentially very job destroying, and automation, which is obviously very job destroying, potentially, most businesses work incredibly hard to hang on to their workforces and hang on to their people. And so you'll talk to lots of business leaders who describe their teams as their second family and their second home. And so if there is a sort of perception that somehow there's almost a sort of, not a joy, but there's almost a sort of delight that technology allows job destruction, reducing the cost base, flowing through to the P&L. My experience has been the opposite, and that's from somebody who's had to let lots of people go, it's had to close stores for all sorts of reasons, not least because of the financial structure of the partnership. I think there is a very, very strong impulse to really to keep as many jobs as possible and indeed to grow roles. Thanks, Aya.
So that more people can get a say in, we'll take 3 questions if that's okay, Sharon, and then turn back to you. So right there in the black hoodie.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for the talk. I'm Rafael. I'm a SPP student here. I can see in my country how polarization, that is a topic that we really see in during the MPA course, is a problem in terms of the question of this lecture, like how to get government and the private sector to work together for the common good. So as an international servant working in an organization like World Bank, how you really connect the dots, how you manage these 2 sides of the map in order to really work together for the common good.
Thanks, Rafael. And do you mean particularly in the context of privatizations, or do you mean more generally?
More generally, like a general aspect in the different countries.
Yeah, I mean,
Can we take a couple more,
yes.
or do you want to take
no,
it?
no, let's.
You're the boss.
No, I'm gonna write down so I don't forget.
Okay.
Rafael, we'll come back.
So I have been in egalitarian, too many questions from this side, so we'll take one right there on this side, please. Yes.
Good evening. My question is more about the ethical tension and
Can you introduce
collaboration.
yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Vaidehi, and I'm a recent graduate from MPA here at SPP. It's good to be back home. How can governments strike a balance between allowing businesses to pursue profit and ensuring that the public partnership prioritizes social needs, like in case of housing or healthcare infrastructure? Because at the end of the day, we would want to have real solutions that drive businesses to want to invest and create profit and also provide the betterment of society.
Take one more and turn back to Sharon. Yes, right there.
Hi, my name's Aka. I study environmental economics here at LSE. I have a question because we talked about having this democratic deficit, and we also talked about the public sector working together with the private sector. And I was curious to get your take on whether there is a role for the private sector to help bridge the democratic deficit. And this is even in the context of the recent US election where X, formerly Twitter, played a pretty decent role, Facebook in the election prior to this, and big tech companies come to mind first and foremost, but also even more broadly, I'd be interested to get your take on instances of regulatory and policy capture from private sectors and private interest groups. And because I'm an environmental economist in training, at least, in the context of the green transition, that's been something that we've seen a couple of times at least. It's a couple of points there, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Super interesting.
Big questions, all of them.
Yeah, I've got about 4 PhD topics that are building. I mean, on the culture point of the private public sector and kind of, things almost being lost in translation, I think there is something about almost having a group of people who act as translators. So if I look at the UK experience, and actually the UK experience is probably is actually rather mixed in terms of business people, for example, coming into government and making a success of that. And there's probably a relatively small stream of public sector officials, workers, experts who then go into business. But it's not an empty set. It's not a null set. And so there are, if I was thinking even of the UK context, there are probably 6 people, 6, 7, 8 people who have made that translation, clear accountability, clear profit line, clear P&L, through to being able to kind of deliver in a much more complicated, much more multi-stakeholder environment. And actually, I think the thing will be to find those people in your country who can make that translation and make that work. So in the UK, there's somebody called Paul Dighton, Lord Dighton, who was Goldman Sachs for a long time, came into the Treasury as a minister, doing a lot of work on sort of regional development, and was almost instantly effective in a way in which many of his predecessors in similar roles had just struggled with that kind of complexity. If you pull a lever and there's kind of nothing at the end of it sometimes in government. So I think figure out who is that community that can act as a bridge rather than necessarily being naive about the ability for those two very different groups to kind of be in a room together. So who's facilitating that conversation and who are the translators, I would say. On kind of the profit social purpose balance. So I am somebody again who rather, I don't know if it's naivety. I think thinking about profit and purpose as two distinct categories, I think is really misplaced, particularly in a business context. Because as soon as you're in a conversation that somehow there's a trade-off between being an effective, profitable company and doing the right thing by your employees and by your customers, you're into waves and fashions, and you're into this sort of the ridiculous culture wars we have around woke capitalism. I don't know what that means. It's a term I find unbelievably frustrating. You know, we know that customers, the public cares about the environment. We know that you know, the great people want to work for companies that have got commitment and to their communities and to social purpose and to draw in talent from different spaces and different areas. And so for me, there is no credible business that doesn't think about profit and purpose being two sides of the same coin. They may not use the language, they may not use the language of ESG, they may not use the language of purpose or mission, but every company has a version of this because you can't hire brilliant people. You can't hang on to brilliant people without these two things being intertwined. And the balance may be different, and you know, maybe may vary by sector, the environment, etc. But those two things have got to hang in a completely intertwined way. And gosh, your last question about the environment and the transition and experience of regulatory capture. I mean, again, I'm going to talk about a UK context. So as a where we are still in a pretty lucky and pretty privileged position that the regulatory environment is independent and works in a pretty aligned way with government, but the decisions are independently scrutinized and ultimately subject to court processes and an independent sort of judiciary and independent kind of appeals process. I think that is that doesn't detract from the need for sort of constructive and open and transparent dialogue between the public and private sector, particularly when you're talking about investments that aren't just for the next 5, 10 years, but for the next 20 years, and where you're investing for a return that may not pay back for 6, 7, 8 years, and where a government action, it could be giving the national grid access to more power, is a key part of the business case. So independence of the regulators, super key. Open, transparent, constructive dialogue between the public and private sector. And I go back to my point about stable, consistent, predictable governance and decision-making is absolutely fundamental.
Thank you, Sharon. We have another 10 minutes or so maybe we'll take 3 more questions. I'll go back to the side here. Yes, second row.
And I don't know if there were any from those who are online as well.
Oh, yes, I knew that I would forget about this and I did, but we'll take your question and then we'll turn to online.
Okay, great. My name is Carmine Soprano. I'm a development economist, an academic lecturer, a policy advisor, but more importantly, a proud SPP alum. Thank you so much for this wonderful and super inspiring conversation. And I want to circle back, if I may, to where we started from, which was voters getting angry and us, trade economists, all of us, not understanding how to convince them to change their attitude. And I'm wondering whether there's something that we're missing in terms of not only the narrative, which probably is a comms issue, but also the tools and the models that we all economists are using. So is there a way to look beyond not only profit maximizing corporations, you made a very eloquent example of all of that just now, Sharon, but also beyond utility maximizing individuals who also care about their own well-being and mental health, for instance, if we look at suicide rates all around the world, as well as depression and level of rage, clearly there's something wrong that we're missing. And equally also looking beyond GDP as the standard metrics of growth. I'm not saying these numbers or these models or these metrics do not exist, but they are failing to become mainstream, and therefore it's natural that someone who's paying eggs thrice the price that she or he was 3 or 4 years ago does not buy into the numbers around unemployment, the GDP growth, and productivity, which we all know, but which clearly don't work. Any thoughts on that? Thanks.
Thank you. Shall we take a question or two from online? Right.
David Cases asks, how can you integrate the private sector in network economies, water, rail, etc., without it affecting quality?
Without
Without affecting quality.
quality. And we'll take one more back there somewhere. Yes, right there. There you go.
Thank you for your beautiful conversation. You discussed about the trend in the US and the UK that seems like very far from my home in Indonesia, but it is somewhat closely related. So because I can see back home the numbers are great, the macro numbers are great, but people are just angry and you said to understand the tails, and the tail seems to like want to leave Indonesia and become the migrant where they probably not being welcomed. And also you said to get the government to work with the private, but they working in a collusive manners. And my question would be like, I really interested in your empathy gap point. And my question would be like, how to close this gap, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of the policy making, because sometimes the empathy is just lost in the process.
So I think the first and third questions, I think they're brilliant questions. I think they're linked. And I think there are lots of components to this. So I think that the data point, GDP. I don't care about GDP when my mental health is struggling. So I think there's a real stream here about what's the data, what are the metrics that actually matter to citizens. And obviously, Professor Layard from many years ago, started some super important work around the importance of measuring happiness. And actually the metrics will be different in well-being, and the metrics will be different in different countries. And I say this not as an add-on, but actually how it then changes both the language and then the policy response. So actually, if I'm concerned or there's a flashing red data about mental health issues in former manufacturing towns, I'm spending less of my political capital trying to just explain to the public why they just don't realize they've had it so good. So I do think what do we as a society now believe is a measure of how healthy, how happy, how productive we are as a community, and getting really variegated, really detailed on that. And then, Liberal Democrats are not great at communicating to people. I think I was joking to Andrés about the 2016 US election after the Brexit vote, which I had not predicted. I sat with my then 11, 12-year-old, my older son, and we watched all the debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And I said, darling, who do you like more? And he said, I really like Hillary. And I said, well, what do you think they'll each do when they become president? And he said, well, I didn't really understand what Hillary said, but you know what? I know Trump's going to build a wall. And that really simple point there is the inability, or we're so strangulated by the facts and the caveats and the qualifiers that we've lost our ability to communicate. And so I do think you're absolutely right. I think your point about it's not just words, it's not just narrative, but I think if we start to measure and we start to converse and talk as societies about the things that people really care about, I think it will prompt different policy response. I think it will prompt more local action. The UK is unlike many of your countries, is a very, very centralized state, uber centralized. I think it's a huge part of the issues in governance in this country. Language, data, and then commensurate action. And then the question online, which is, you privatize all these utilities and it's a little bit of a disaster with the private sector. I would say it goes back to the regulatory question, I think. Well-funded, highly expert regulators who are degree of stability and degree of stability of the leadership there too, I think is the way through.
Communications to be an effective policymaker. We've talked about that, haven't we? It could not be more important. We have time for one last round. Ideally, keep your questions very brief because we don't have a lot of time, but I'll take 2 or 3 more. Yes, sir, right there.
Hi, my name is Sachin Iyer. I'm studying in the Master of Public Policy program. And before joining the SPP, I worked in investment banking for a decade and a half. So my question is about financial sector regulation, or specifically about deregulation, which Chancellor Reeves has been speaking about quite vocally recently. Now, to me, it partly seems a response to deregulation that's coming in the US soon with Mr. Trump getting elected. But beyond that, I wonder how financial sector deregulation will actually help the UK. Is this about actually addressing that lost productivity that you mentioned has sort of been there since 2008? Because financial services is a big part of the UK economy still. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Alexander, in the front here, please.
Thank you very much. Alexander Evans, a professor in practice at the School of Public Policy. Virtually no Director Generals or Permanent Secretaries in the UK have ever worked outside Whitehall. They haven't worked in the NHS. They haven't worked in devolved administrations. They haven't worked in local government. They haven't been on the front line. Is that a problem? And what should the UK be thinking about doing to remedy that?
One last question. The very back there.
Hi, Cyril Estier. You mentioned at the beginning the use of AI to deliver more effectively some government services. There's also the Tony Blair Institute who mentions that there could be 200 billion saved over 5 years. Do you think there would be, suppose we had this perfect AI algorithm that could save and render the government more efficient, is there the political will in government to adopt these new technologies?
Great question. All great questions. So technically, I mean, we should talk. I'm fascinated by kind of career in investment banking, and then coming back into education. I mean, deregulation. I mean, I can go on about this for a long time. So so financial services regulation is not. It's not my area. And actually, if you read the Mansion House speech, what the Chancellor was talking about was some very quite specific rules that apply for, I would say, relatively junior leaders in financial institutions. I think that there is a much bigger question, which is what are the big levers of growth and productivity improvement? And you know, I'm not sure that's the place I would start. I definitely think there's a deregulatory pro-competition element of this, but you know, higher education, a sustainable funding system planning that we've talked about, I think is a enormously important driver. So there are probably 3 or 4 really big levers that don't necessarily cost money fiscally, but will take political will and take kind of sustained delivery commitment over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And I think of all of them, I would probably put the planning regime kind of way at the top. I mean, Alexander, your question about the kind of skill set and background of senior civil services is kind of very interesting. I spent quite a lot of time in the last few weeks. I'm interviewing with some other colleagues for the person who will head the civil service in the UK. And it's really striking that there were a number of civil servants who were civil servants for a long time and then left to go in. I guess I'm an example, left to then kind of develop, I guess, outside of Whitehall. But it's also true that many, probably the majority of those who are now at the top of the civil service, not all, but the majority, have come into the civil service in the UK at least as kind of fast stream graduate entry in their early 20s. There are some exceptions. You know, there have been 1 or 2 permanent secretaries who've come directly in from local government, 1 or 2 who've come in at Director General level. It's not always an easy transition. But I think what is probably more beneficial and also more realistic is, you know, should there be a rule that you cannot become a Director General, you cannot reach the top of the civil service without having spent 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years running a public service, being running a public agency, being out of the cold face, feels pretty attractive to me, as somebody who got to this rather later in life. The question about political will, I don't know, I kind of think you create your own political will. I mean, if you think about, again, I'm talking from a very UK context, but probably the 2 most transformational prime ministers, certainly in my lifetime, were probably Tony Blair, who was elected in 1997, and Margaret Thatcher, who was elected in 1979. So now quite historic. Whether that's for Mrs. Thatcher, the rebalancing of the tax system from direct to indirect taxes, whether that's whether you think these are good things or not, but the fundamental change in the labour laws, labour legislation for a more flexible labour market, a more pro-competition, more pro-business environment, and then sort of public service reform, devolution reform under Tony Blair. I mean, I sort of think that how the technology revolution does or doesn't become a beneficial core to public service reform will require the same quality and tenacity of leadership and communication and explanation and delivery. But I think, you know, the founding of the welfare state after the Second World War, reform of this scale has been done by previous governments, but it has taken a very particular visionary, you know, scars on their backs, form of leadership. And so I think it comes down to communication, but it comes down really to tenacious, visionary, dogged leadership that can cope with a fight.
Wonderful. I think you will all agree with me that good conversation. Oops, sorry about that. Good conversations pose some questions, answer some questions, and they give rise to even more questions that we would all like to address. But we are 5 minutes past our appointed ending time. So all that remains is to say thank you, Sharon. It's been a great, great conversation. And thank you to everybody who made it here on a very cold night. I think you will all agree with me that we've been privileged to be part of a great event. And at the SPP, we will have more of these, no doubt. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you.